Welcome to today's lesson on comparing fractions. Today we're going to discuss how to compare two different fractions and decide whether one is less than, greater than, or equal to the other. Before we can get started, let's discuss why it's important to compare fractions. How could this ever help us in the real world? Well, let me ask you, would you prefer to have 2/3 of a candy bar or 2/5 of a candy bar? Well, you're probably going to want the larger amount, right? So which fraction is larger, 2/3 or 2/5? So there's a couple ways that we can approach this problem, but one way is to use fraction bars. So I'm going to pull up a fraction bar representing 2/3. 2 out of 3 parts are shaded. And now I'm going to pull up a fraction bar representing 2/5. Now notice each of these fraction bars are still the same length, we just split them into different amounts. So this has 2 out of 5 pieces shaded in. So which one has more shaded in? 2/5 or 2/3? Well, actually you're right. 2/3 is larger than 2/5 because we shade in more of our fraction bar. So you might be a little confused. You might be wondering, why isn't 2/5 larger? The 5 is a larger number than the 3. Well, remember, we're not comparing just the denominators. You're comparing the parts to the whole. So even though they both have 2 parts shaded, our bottom fraction is split into a lot more pieces, which means each piece is smaller than if you had 2/3. Now that we have gone over some basics, let's start with an example. You will see 2 fraction bars below. Each fraction bar is split into fifths. So this fraction bar has 1, 2, 3 out of 5 pieces shaded. So this fraction bar represents 3/5. This bar has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces shaded. So this fraction bar represents 4/5. Now when you're comparing fractions, one of the first things you're going to look for is the denominator. And you're going to ask yourself, is the denominator the same? If the denominator is the same, that makes your job pretty easy. That means you only have to compare the numerators. The next part is pretty easy. All you have to do is compare the 3 and the 4. So which one's bigger, 3 or 4? We can also look at our fraction bars here. Which fraction bar has less parts shaded? Since 3 is a smaller number than 4, and 3/5 has less parts shaded than 4/5, that means that 3/5 is less than 4/5. Now remember, 3/5 is going to be on the smaller side of our symbol here because it's less than 4/5. 4/5 is going to be on the larger side here because 4/5 is the larger number. Comparing two fractions that have the same denominator is pretty simple. It gets tricky when you're trying to compare two fractions that have different denominators. For example, if I asked you if 2/3 is less than or greater than 3/4, would you be able to tell me? It'd be pretty difficult because 4 and 3 are different numbers. So that means that each part of the whole is a different size. But you're in luck because I'm going to teach you 3 simple steps to comparing fractions that have different denominators. Step 1 for comparing fractions. You need to find a common denominator for the fractions that you're comparing. One way to find a common denominator is by multiplying your two denominators together. So if we multiply 3 times 4, we get the number 12. So that's a common denominator that we can create for our two fractions. Step 2. You need to find an equivalent fraction using your common denominators. So if we go ahead and we take a look at 2/3 and 3/4, we're going to find an equivalent fraction for these numbers that are in twelfths because that's the common denominator that we found. So if we multiply 3 times 4, that's going to give us twelfths. And if we multiply our denominator, we have to multiply our numerator. So 2 times 4 equals 8. 3 times 4 equals 12. So we just found an equivalent fraction with our common denominator of twelfths. So let's go ahead and do that for 3/4. If we multiply 4 times 3, and then we multiply 3 times 3, we get an equivalent fraction of 9/12. So we've now completed step 2. On to step 3. Our last step is to compare the numerators. Now that we have equivalent fractions, we can look at these as they have the same denominator. So looking at the questions and numbers that we have right now, we have 8/12 with an 8 as the numerator and 9/12 with a 9 as the numerator. That means that 9/12 is the greater number because the numerator is higher and our denominator shows that each of the pieces are the same size. So we know that 8/12 is less than 9/12. Or we can say that 2/3 is less than 3/4. Let's go ahead and review what you've learned in today's lesson. There are 3 symbols that you're using when you compare fractions. You have less than, greater than, or equal to. There are also 3 basic steps that you need to use to compare fractions. Step 1, you need to find a common denominator. If you were to find if 2/5 is greater than or less than 1/3, you would need to find a common denominator. So 5 times 3 is 15. Step 2, you need to find an equivalent fraction that shares that common denominator. So if we multiply 5 times 3 and 2 times 3, we will get an equivalent fraction of 6/15. If I multiply 3 times 5 and 1 times 5, then I get an equivalent fraction of 5/15. And step 3. Once you have found the equivalent fractions, then you can go ahead and compare the numerators to those fractions to see which one is larger. So you have 6/15 and 5/15. Since 6 is greater than 5, 6/15 is greater than 5/15, which means that 2/5 is greater than 1/3.